Good morning, everybody. This is Barry O'Connell, and I have a very special guest on here today, Richard Elliot. Richard and I disagree on almost everything, except those things we agree with, and there are a few of them, but it's always important to get a different perspective. Richard has a terrible fault. He's progressive. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning, Barry. Thank you for having me. I am excited to talk with you and for your audience to hear about the 2028 presidential primary, which we can talk about from the perspective of both parties, about the primary schedule, about some of the candidates and their strengths and weaknesses, and about what we think is going to happen. Barry is in the state of South Carolina, one of the most important states in the Democratic presidential primary, and a state that will determine the outcome, most likely, of determining the front runner, at least for the final stages of the race. You would agree with that, Barry?
I think it's going to have a huge impact starting Monday morning. You know what happens Monday morning?
Tell me what happens Monday morning.
Uh, Potential presidential candidate. He says he's not running, but we all know what that means. Wes Moore will be in the 116th district near Charleston in the lowlands. You have to understand, South Carolina is a three-stage state. The lowlands are the area close to the Atlantic Ocean. It's actually physically low, it's close to water level. It's down there in the islands and the rivers and the streams, and that's a crucial area. Um, it's also the home of Congressman Jim Clyburn, who is probably the one of the last few old-fashioned godfathers, kingmakers um, in Democratic presidential politics. Jim's
Hmm.
one of those people you need to go see, and his chief aide for many years, Clay Middleton, is running for delegate, whatever their version is, um, representative in the 116th, and Wes will be down there spending the day campaigning with them. So that's a big deal.
That is a very big deal. I did not know about that, but that is a very big deal. It is also a big deal to note that Jim Clyburn and his influence have so stunted the wave of Jim Crow redistricting in South Carolina that his district is going to be maintained at least until 2028. That is remarkable. I think that his role and influence and power for helping black South Carolinians and white South Carolinians alike, and for helping the South generally, has been remarkable. Jim Clyburn's endorsement, followed by the coalescing of other candidates behind Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential primary, was the largest factor in putting Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders. And the fact that the Bernie Sanders campaign did not even attempt to parlay with Clyburn is an indicator of political amateurism and a criticism that I have of that campaign. But everybody now sees that South Carolina is one of the most important states, if not the most important state, for a black candidate. Let's go over the opening schedule. The calendar starts with Iowa. Iowa is not a heavily Democratic state. It is purple at best, and it has caucuses. Candidates that excite the grassroots leaders of the Democratic Party, not the voters, but the grassroots leaders benefit the most in the caucuses. Pete Buttigieg did very well in the preceding Iowa primary. Uh, Joe Biden did not do incredible. Bernie Sanders came in second. Kamala Harris did not do well at all. So there's a big question of if Kamala Harris does choose to run again. I'm under the impression she will. How well would she do in the opening two states of Iowa and New Hampshire? And I would even argue that when the Democratic candidate is able to win the nomination without Iowa or New Hampshire determining the outcome, does it not make sense to move a state like Maryland, like Illinois, like Virginia closer to the front of the calendar?
One of the things that I think we need to consider, um, people say we shouldn't talk about race, but so much of this comes down to a racial component. Um, Iowa is, and I don't remember the point whatever, but 88% white.
Yep.
Um, Somewhere no more than 3% black.
Mm-hmm.
It's a place where we have a lot more Hispanics um, than we have black people. That's not the case in much of the United States. Then we go to New Hampshire, and that is nine. That's 89% black.
White.
Same. I'm sorry, white.
You good? You good?
Um, and so we end up with a case where the Democratic Party has front loaded the two of the very whitest states for years, skewing the results. What would have happened if Jesse Jackson in 84 or 88 had the ability to run in a state like South Carolina, which, by the way, in the Democratic primary, averages 50 to 55% black. So suddenly, it's a real test because you can't win the presidency without black votes, especially as a Democrat. And if you can't show well in a place like South Carolina, you're in trouble. So, yes, it did give Joe Biden the impetus to run and win and be a success in 20. Um, Now we're going to get into a case where uh, who's the who's the I was going to say the black choice, but who's Jim Clyburn's choice? Because
That's
Jim
a very
doesn't always
that,
go for black candidates.
that's a very good question. In my opinion, it is going to be a very important question, not of who wins Iowa or New Hampshire, both of which don't really reflect, even the surrounding states very well, because Massachusetts is a pretty liberal state, Maine is a pretty populist state, etc. But also that Nevada is a state that reflects the union vote and a lot of the Latino vote. And Bernie Sanders, for example, he won Nevada and won it decisively. Nevada, I believe, is another caucus state. If
Yes.
there is a surge and I'll just say a reform Democrat. I don't even know what name there would be, but let's just say a Democrat that is not the desired pick of much of the existing Congress people, governors, etc., is able to catch fire. Jim Clyburn operates as that fire blanket to help put them out. On the other hand, let's say that Kamala Harris is able to. I don't think that she's going to win Iowa or New Hampshire just off of the electorates, but like Nevada, I think Nevada is a state where she could potentially do very well. And that if she wins Nevada, Jim Clyburn could potentially help her carry forward that momentum. I do not know what he's going to do, and he has incredible sway. Maybe one could argue that Clyburn has the most sway out of any individual in the Democratic electorate, out of everybody, even more so than Obama, because Obama is not going to endorse until later in that process.
I think that's fair. And I think one thing to consider is that Jim Clyburn is 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 a Democrat. He's not a progressive Democrat. He's not a socialist Democrat. He's a Democrat. And I have a feeling that whoever he picks is going to be with an eye towards maintaining the Democratic Party as an institution.
A-
So
a-
maybe we could
abs-
call him institutional.
Absolutely. And while it would not surprise me that if he would pick Vice President Harris as his choice, it would also not surprise me radically if he were to select Gavin Newsom, or even potentially Pete Buttigieg. In the upcoming primary, we are going to have a lot of discussions about electability, about fundraising, about coalitions, and and especially if Kamala Harris chooses not to run, there could be a wide variety of candidates. So, can we start talking about the candidates, or do you want to keep talking about the early calendar?
I would let me preface it this way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm looking at who's in South Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
and we've seen a constant stream of candidates through here that are not getting the attention on the national level, but they're getting attention in the low country, in the Midlands, in the mountains. Um, people like Andy Bashir has been through here more than once. Um, uh, Pritzker, um, spending a lot of money in South Carolina. He's getting
Mm-hmm.
out. He's seeing people. He's looking to build coalitions. So we're seeing um, you, and of course, Gavin Newsom from California is seems to be every place, and he gets a lot of press. But he gets a lot of press. Is he the press's pick, or is he the Democrats' pick? And that's sort of where we're at. So go ahead. Let's talk about the candidates.
So we're going to start with the diamond level candidate, the one who determines the rest of the race. And that is obviously Kamala Harris. She ran last time. She was the nominee last time. She did not have a lot of time to run, but she raised such an inordinate amount of money that if she chose to run, she eats up a lot of fundraising to begin with. Then let's get to the gold level candidates. I think that would include Gavin Newsom and possibly Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. These are candidates that have large networks, that have huge fundraising, that would absolutely have a large splash if they chose to run immediately. Immediately, regardless of whether Kamala ran or not. That is another factor why I'm calling them gold level candidates. This is not my assessment of my support for them, just about how they impact the race. Then there's the kind of the silver tier. You have Pete Buttigieg, you have J.B. Pritzker, you have Gretchen Whitmer, who just announced that she's not running for president. You have Governor Wes Moore, candidates that have a state that they would almost certainly win immediately and where they might have regional appeal. But it is hard to imagine them in their current political form having inroads in states halfway across the nation. That's how I would basically overlay the field. And there's some other, sort of wild cards. I think that, for example, Josh Shapiro, Andy Bashir, John Ossoff, candidates that have large appeal based on their profiles, but that I don't think have the networks or fundraising to do it without large amounts of institutional support.
How much of a factor do you think the military is going to play in in this upcoming election? Does it help West that he's a veteran?
So, point of history. Let's say, the year is 1946. A majority of registered voters have been involved in the war effort, whether they have been troops, whether they have been reserves, whether they have been, building weapons in the factory. In the year of our Lord 2026, there are something like 10% or so of the population that are military or military dependents. It is a significantly smaller section of the population, but that section of the population is largely distributed in Georgia, in Maryland, in South Carolina, in states where those votes are important. But it's not just about the military vote, it's also about the individuals that respect visible patriotism, visible support for their country. I don't know how much of a voting bloc that is relative to several of the different other issue or identity groups that usually would come to the forefront even for a lot of military voters, whether they be a progressive that's oriented about healthcare, whether they be a moderate that is oriented about sensible tax policy, whether they be a person that's focused on a particular industry in their state, whether they're a Louisianian focused on rice policy. I think generally speaking that military, while it's an important identity piece, it is very rarely a formative political identity piece for a voter.
Well, let's talk about pieces for the voters because I think that's a consideration. We don't normally look at the military and military adjacent vote as significant in Democratic circles because we don't usually have candidates who can appeal to the military and military adjacent vote.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm taking a look now at Maryland's governor's race in 30. And, when you start adding up um, how significant is that military adjacent vote, you find out that in Maryland, for instance, it's heavily black. And there's somewhere between 3 to 400,000 people that you could put into that category. Uh, that's going to make a difference. Now, that's just one state. That's just one example. But when you take a look at Maryland, a block of 3 to 400,000 Democrats comes out to larger than the city of Baltimore in in Maryland politics. And when you start to look at it that way, if you have somebody who could tap that vote, that's a significant chunk of votes that we don't normally look to. So I'm wondering on a national level, can West tap into a vote that people will pay attention to him because of his military history? An awful lot of young black guys went to Afghanistan.
I think
So
that it is so I think it's a motivating factor, but we're operating under the assumption of a non-Harris race. I don't think that by itself is enough, particularly when I think that a lot of people, even people who ordinarily aren't, are going to be very ideology focused and very fight focused. And on with the governor might run a campaign that uses the word fight and that emphasizes his masculine traits. That does not necessarily collate with a lot of voters that he is going to be a person that has good inroads with the Congress people, that has an agenda that would help to solve some of the underlying faults of Trumpism. But where did the voters see between campaign strategy and policy is a question that we'll be asking for the next 1,000 years.
constantly, of course, I think it comes down to and I don't have an opinion in this race. I'm not supporting anybody yet. Um, there's a number of people I like quite a bit. I like Pritzker. I like Andy Bashir. I like Shapiro in Pennsylvania. Um, I like Wes Moore. He's a great guy. So, liking a wide range of people, it comes down to can whoever's going to win this race, I have a feeling, is going to dominate it in the first handful of states. So, can can the vice president Kamala Harris come out of uh, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina as a dominant leader? If she can't come out of there as a dominant preemptive leader, then it's possible to stop her.
Yep. It's a very this is a rather unique primary process or situation, I'd say. There is a presumed front runner, a person who has the former vice president who has huge amounts of fundraising, universal name recognition, but where quite a few people are going to be hesitant about her candidacy for a variety of reasons, to the left, to the right, because she's black, because she's a woman, because she lost, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that makes it where she does have the potential, sort of, Lyndon Johnson 1968, where she collapses so poorly in the opening 3 or 4 states that she is not a viable candidate. A more apt scenario, or a more apt comparison, might be sort of a Jeb Bush in 2016 sort of scenario. But at the same token, it is hard to imagine a majoritarian candidate. I'll talk about sort of now about the coalitions of the candidates to give exact definition to what you're talking about. If
Okay.
if Harris collapses, it will likely be because Pete Buttigieg is able to do very well in Iowa and is able to transmit that to New Hampshire. Um, I don't know if that would necessarily be the case, because Iowa, like I said before, is a caucus state that is dominated by individuals that are passionate enough to be at a caucus site for several hours, ideologically driven individuals. That can take the party in a variety of different directions. Particularly when Bernie Sanders was in second in that primary. And I think a lot of Bernie Sanders voters are going to end up moving to Kamala Harris. That's my opinion at present. That could change. New Hampshire, however, is a much more moderate, a much more rural state. It does not have the same number of college towns, for example, as Iowa. So I think that Pete Buttigieg would be a strong candidate in Iowa, whereas Gavin Newsom might do very well in New Hampshire. Nevada is an entirely different animal. It's a caucus state, and it's a very union heavy state, and it's strongly Latino. I think Gavin Newsom, largely based on his redistricting, but several other things, posturing himself as a political fighter for the American people, I think that is going to yield him strong dividends in Nevada, in spite of the fact that he's not a union strong guy. I actually have no clue at present who the unions will get behind. I personally am a fan of J.B. Pritzker among other candidates. I think that J.B. Pritzker could end up being the union candidate. Illinois has a large number of union workers, larger than a lot of other states. And Illinois is more representative of the nation's demographics than any other state. Black voters, Latino voters, white voters, young white voters and old white voters, suburban, rural, urban, etc. Illinois is the most representative state in the nation. And of course, we get to then South Carolina, where Jim Clyburn's endorsement is huge. But when you have people that spend years cultivating their own audiences in the state, several governors endorsing different than Clyburn could change the race. But we have to see. I want to hear the words of Barry O'Connell now. I've talked long enough.
I would suggest that Pritzker is seen by many people as a Chicago politician. And going back to the Mayor Richard Daley days, that's not always a positive image. There was a television show based on Chicago corruption called The Good Wife, which stayed on through a whole 7 year cycle. I mean, America does not perhaps see does not always see Illinois as the home of fair politics. I'm trying to be
Absolutely.
nice as I say that.
No,
So I
absolutely. And then you add in the fact that he's a billionaire, and I don't think that is helpful necessarily. Any theory for Pritzker is reliant upon him doing very well in the Midwest. And while I've said before, I don't know if there's going to be a candidate that just could up and run and be successful. Iowa borders Illinois. There are a large number of Iowan voters that have already seen J.B. Pritzker ads via being in the media market, that have been into the state that he represents, etc. That is not saying I think he'd have an enormous coalition there to begin with, but it'd be a decent start compared to everybody else. And when you have a Whitmer that is not running, I think that Pritzker could do very well in Michigan, depending on how long that primary goes on for.
I'm disappointed to see the governor of Michigan bail out this early.
I
I
agree. I think
I
she's
think she'd be
done
a
a good
strong
job.
think she'd be a strong candidate. I think, and to understand where we're going, sometimes it helps to take a look at where we've been. If they had gone with the candidates most likely to win the blue wall um, in 24, we'd probably have a Democratic president right now. So the candidates most likely to win that blue wall would have been Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro.
Hmm.
But now I'm not one of the people who subscribe to the theory of the pantsuit mafia, but the idea that the so-called pantsuit mafia jumped on Harris and never gave the delegates a choice to decide certainly has to have some credence. I think in a lot of ways the inside crowd, the East Coast and West Coast establishment um, goes towards Harris. Uh, the idea that she's black, she's been blacker and blacker and blacker all through this race. The more you want her to win, the blacker she gets. I remember when she was an Indian and black politician, and now she's a black politician. Um, it isn't whether or not I think she's black that's important. She lost in 24 because she couldn't deliver the younger black vote in the blue wall state. And when I say blue wall, let me give a quick explanation. Every presidential race in recent memory has come down to three states. It's a three-state race. If you win the three states, all three of the three states, you win the presidency as a Democrat. And if you don't, the Republicans take it. So we're stuck at 226 votes in the Electoral College. That's where we max out. And, think of it this way: no matter who the candidate is, Democrats are not going to win Alabama. And no matter who the Republican is, he's not going to win Maryland. There's certain states that are carved in stone, already set. How they're going to vote. It comes down to three battleground states, and that's Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And you can't win the Democratic presidency without winning all three of those. Um, Barack Obama won them consistently in 8 and 12. Hillary didn't quite do it in 16. And you're thinking, well, okay, how bad was it? Take Philadelphia, for instance. In the black vote, she pulled 65%, which sounds pretty good. But if she had gotten up over 70%, she would have been president. We run into these cases where older black females turn out to vote for the Harrises and the Clintons. Younger black folks stayed home. It isn't that they all ran over to vote for Trump, despite what the media tries to tell us. It really comes down to, oh, what the hell? I'm not going to bother. This isn't my election. And people didn't vote for Harris because too many people saw her as the man. And I don't mean that in a sexist sense. I mean, they saw her as the prosecutor, the person devoted, the person who made her career, the person who got ahead by locking up young blacks. And that was something she didn't overcome to where this became a problem for her, and she didn't pull the black vote, even though she was supposedly the black candidate. Comments?
Uh, I'm going to pivot it to a criticism of the campaign that was given by Philadelphia Democratic Party Chairman Bob Brady. That the campaign for Harris, like the campaign for Clinton, largely operated independently from the local and state entities. That is a major criticism that was given by Bob Brady. And while I don't necessarily agree with his tone and everything that he said, I think there is quite a bit to be said that supporting the local entities that have spent decades turning voters out more successfully than had been done basically up until vote by mail, that I have to encourage that whoever the Democratic nominee is, that they do partner with the city, state, county parties, because they're the ones that know the people. They are the ones that have the relationships and the favors and the remembrances and the light of reflection in their eyes when they talk to the voters. The presidential campaign for quite a few people is utterly inaccessible and well above where they have any influence. And they understand this. But when your local central committeeman or your local delegate or your local county council member is active and fervent on turnout for the candidate, and it's all well constructed and well organized as the Maryland the Maryland coordinated campaign has been, that is a major push, because that push has helped to elevate minority turnout in Maryland. And thus, I believe that's one of the most major factors in encouraging turnout across the rest of the country, particularly in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, in Milwaukee, in Detroit, in Ann Arbor, in Cleveland, in Columbus, and in Cincinnati.
As a Democratic activist, I've often got the feeling that when they have the huge cattle uh, callings for Democrats to come together to support Harris, and if you actually went, and I ran into the same thing with both Clintons. If you actually went, the closest you're going to get to the candidate is about 3 blocks away, and you hear them over a loudspeaker. There's, you're right. There's not a feeling of personalities. There's not a feeling of closeness, and I think that's a consideration. Um, we're falling into campaign techniques, but I think that's a very important thing. I think with Barack Obama, he was a pivotal figure because he was the first um, dark skinned candidate to have a serious chance to win. Um, I don't want to get into the discussion of whether or not he was African American or African and white. And I don't think that's a good conversation to have, but I think it came down to he excited people across the board and became a pivotal um, candidate. I think
Absolutely.
Biden was seen as a Democratic candidate um, that made people feel good about themselves and harkened back to the Obama days, and that was
Yep.
certainly a consideration.
I agree with that as well. And note for Joe Biden. Joe Biden ran the strongest among rural voters and among old voters of any Democrat since Lyndon Baines Johnson. So if you look at Obama's strengths, which were largely black voters, young voters, there weren't very many progressive voters at that time, but among the progressive voters there were within the Democratic Party. Those three groups were his bread and butter. Whereas for Biden, his bread and butter was suburbanites, boomers, the few rural voters in the Democratic Party, and I think also doing pretty just generally very well among black voters. The thing that Kamala Harris has to do in this primary process is expand her coalition. If Kamala Harris is able to start adding Latino voters to her coalition, if Kamala Harris is able to add I think that she did well among Asian voters, but if she's able to add more Asian voters to her coalition, if she's able to add new demographic areas in the 2024 election map, basically the only area only areas where Harris outperformed Biden was like in East Tennessee and North Georgia. I think those were basically the only areas where she overperformed relative to him. If she is able to reverse that trend and get significant inroads among really any of the different coalitions, she is a very formidable candidate. Gavin Newsom is going to have very serious problems among black voters, I think, as well. I mean, Pete Buttigieg has well publicized issues with black voters. I think that Pete Buttigieg routinely is at or below 5% for black voters in national polls. And if you look at his campaign events, they are lily white. And I think that is largely due to his lack of record and to him representing a town that was incredibly small, basically relative to anybody else that is running. Just to be blunt, quite a few African Americans know somebody in their network that is roughly as qualified as Buttigieg based on the number of people they've governed, whether that be a military colonel, whether that be a longtime principal, etc. Does that make sense to you?
It does. But let me ask you a question about Pete, because this would help me to understand him, because I don't pay nearly as much attention to him as I should.
Uh huh.
Um, can he reach out? Can he pull a vote? Can he be a candidate that reaches out to non-college Christian voters, white Christian voters?
I understand your point. Pete Buttigieg's coalition is very similar to Elizabeth Warren's. It is, I would say, 45 and older, white, well to do, winners of meritocracy in their mind, university educated, very often master's university educated, that are not particularly policy voters, is the difference between Buttigieg and Warren. Warren voters were more like Sanders voters and more like Harris voters than like Buttigieg voters. A lot of I would imagine that if you were to look at the average income, for example, of voter in the 2020 primary, Buttigieg might have been in first place in that race for average income of voter in the primary. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely.
Because it is largely a politics that is mostly devoid of policy, that is absolutely devoid of any movements, whether that be unions, whether that be women, labor, civil rights, etc. It is a politics of um, I am a very smart and wise individual that knows how to solve all of the problems, which I don't think is correct personally, and which I don't think reflects the way that the president works. I think that the president works by having a lot of other things represented underneath them where they don't have expertise. So that's my opinion of the limitation of Buttigieg. I don't think he does well in any of the South unless there's a very, very split primary. And I think that in a lot of the Latino states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado to some degree, I don't think he does very well. I think California could maybe be okay for him, but he just does not have a electoral map that I think works outside of the momentum theory that he attempted in 2020 to win Iowa, do well in New Hampshire. But Nevada and South Carolina are both awful states for Pete Buttigieg. Neither one of them is very good for him. In fact, I would almost say that Pete Buttigieg you could call a country club Democrat.